Good morning, everyone. Happy Tuesday morning, and welcome back to Morning Musings. My name is Don K. Preston. I am the president of Preterist Research Institute of Ardmore, Oklahoma. Do you have your plans made for July the 11th through the 13th? Ardmore, Oklahoma, Preterist Pilgrim Weekend. I tell you what, we've got a great lineup of speakers. We've got Rod MacArthur, we've got William Bell, we've got Daniel Rogers, we've got Michael Miano. I feel like I'm leaving somebody out, and I really apologize for that. So I won't say that. Good morning, everyone. Happy Tuesday morning to you. Welcome back to Morning Musings. My name is Don K. Preston. I am the president of Preterist Research Institute of Ardmore, Oklahoma. Well, I hope you've got your plans made to come be with us July the 11th through the 13th, 2019, here in Ardmore, Oklahoma, for our Preterist Pilgrim Weekend. All right. We are looking at the Great Apostasy. We are told constantly, men such as Tim LaHaye, Thomas Ice, and most dispensationalists, they tell us that we've been experiencing in evangelical Christianity, we've been experiencing the great apostasy foretold by Jesus in Matthew 24 and by Paul in 2 Thessalonians chapter 2. We've been experiencing that. And Tim LaHaye some years ago in one of his books, written in the early 70s, he just insisted that what was going on in America right there was the proof positive that 2 Thessalonians chapter 2 was being fulfilled in that very generation. And of course, he predicted the coming of the Lord was just right around the corner. He gave a long list of the, quote, signs of the end that he insisted were present right then and right there, and thus the end is drawn near. How many others have appealed to Jesus' prediction of the great apostasy and Paul's prediction of the apostasy and insisted that's happening in America today, that's happening in Christianity right now? And yet they completely and totally overlook or ignore the fact that Jesus said it was going to happen in his generation. They ignore the testimony, as we've been sharing with you in this series, that the apostasy was very real. It's found on the pages of the New Testament epistles. It's found even in the book of Acts to a certain extent. They completely overlook or ignore the fact that Paul said that the man of sin that is connected to the apostasy in 2 Thessalonians chapter 2 was already sitting in the temple of God. He was already alive. He was already being restrained. It's kind of hard to be restrained if you're not there. So, those who tell us that the predictions of the apostasy, foretold in Matthew 24 and foretold in 2 Thessalonians chapter 2, or foretold in 1 Timothy 4, 2 Timothy chapter 3, those who tell us that is for our day are completely and totally ignoring the biblical evidence, the biblical emphatic statements that the apostasy was very real in the first century. Now, I want to shift gears at the moment. And this may not be absolutely 100% related to the great apostasy, but in a way it's directly related, all right? Paul, in writing 2 Thessalonians, told the church there not to be shaken in mind by a letter, an epistle as if it was from him, or by a spirit, teaching that the day of the Lord has already come. Look, I'll just never, ever forget. I was sitting in my office. This was in the late 70s. I was sitting in my office, and I was reading from that text. Pardon me. And I had my Greek text there. And as I read that from 2 Thessalonians chapter 2, I thought, well, I'll just take a look at the Greek. And it was a Greek interlinear. And the Greek interlinear said that the day of the Lord has already come. What? Don't let, pardon me, don't let anyone convince you that the day of the Lord has already come. I mean, this was like a thunderbolt. This was like, you know, they talk about the proverbial 2x4 up beside the head. No. This was like a 8x14 up beside the head. I sat there literally stunned. Why? Well, because at the time, I believed that the day of the Lord was an earth-burning, time-ending event, when every person who had ever died, gone back to the dust, you know, been consumed by the fish of the sea or whatever, that was the day of the Lord. Resurrection of every dead person out of the dirt, Jesus coming out of heaven as a 5'5" Jewish man, the earth burns up in a moment, in the twinkling of an eye. That was my concept of the day of the Lord. Here is Paul saying, don't let anyone deceive you into believing that the day of the Lord has already come. And of course, in 2 Timothy chapter 2, he talked about Hymenaeus and Philetus, who are teaching that the resurrection has already passed, overthrowing the faith of some. And you know, people accuse full preterists of teaching that. They don't even know what they're affirming. It is absolutely unbelievable what they are claiming when they say that modern preterists are the same as Hymenaeus and Philetus. Anyway, so as I sat there literally stunned, I'm going, wait a minute. How in the world could anyone convince anyone that the day of the Lord, as I believed at the time it was supposed to be, had already happened? How could Hymenaeus and Philetus convince anyone that the resurrection had already happened? Now listen, folks. If you don't see a problem here, you're not looking and you're not paying attention. I say that with all kindness and I say that with all respect. But if you don't see a problem, you're not looking. World-class scholars throughout the ages have seen the problem. Men such as F.F. Bruce, in his commentary on Thessalonians, says there's absolutely no question that the proper translation of the Greek is, don't let anyone deceive you that the day of the Lord has already come. Some translators, you really got to catch the power of this, okay? Some translators, some commentators take the following approach. Point number one, there's no doubt whatsoever that the proper Greek translation is, has already come. However, no one could believe that the day of the Lord had already come. Therefore, we will translate it as the good old King James translators did. We will translate it as, don't let anyone convince you that the day of the Lord is just at hand. Wait a minute. That is theological bias driving translation. That is illegitimate. Folks, we cannot allow, we cannot agree to changing the Greek text based upon our presuppositional concepts of what the day of the Lord was supposed to be. So, back then even, I jotted out about a 4-page article asking the question, how is this possible? I sent it to a friend of mine who has a master's in the Greek. He may have his PhD by now. Extremely erudite, great logician. And I said, I'm sending this to you in confidence. Now again, keep in mind, this is a man who is engaged in formal public debate. He is a man fully qualified to teach Greek, just a master logician. I sent it to him and I said, listen, man, you got to help me out here. I mean, here's what I'm seeing. I've looked at all the commentaries that I could find. I've looked at every Greek text I can find. I see no way out of this translation has already come. I'm troubled when the commentators allow their theological bias to change the Greek translation. Please explain this to me. He wrote back after about 6 or 8 weeks, which bothered me. He wrote back and he said, Don, I'm not qualified to deal with this. And I was like, not qualified? You got a master's in the Greek? You are a debater? You are a logician? And you're not qualified? And then he said, Don, I'd like your permission to submit this article to a man, and he called his name, who was considered at the time one of the greatest logicians in our fellowship. And he said, I'll send it anonymously, but he said, I know that he's certainly fully qualified to deal with this. I'm not. Wrote back and I told him, okay, fine. Now, this was before the days of email and, cell phones, kid couldn't text. So anyway, I said, go ahead. I got to have some help here. After almost 6 months, he sends a response back to me. He had sent this letter to this scholar and said, please deal with this. This scholar had simply scribbled a note at the bottom of the page that said, this is a whole lot to do about nothing. Really? I knew then. I knew instantly. I knew without a doubt that I have a major problem with my eschatology. Because here are 2 men who were in fact, based upon their academic credentials, based upon their knowledge of the Greek, fully qualified to demonstrate the fallacy, if such there was, of the translation of 2 Thessalonians chapter 2, that don't let anyone deceive you that the day of the Lord has already come. They didn't even try. And listen to me, since then, I have gone to one library after another, college, university libraries. I have examined commentator after commentator after commentator, seeking to find some reasonable linguistic justification for changing the translation. I have not found one single solid argument. I wrote that initial 4-page letter, and as a result of ensuing translations or examination of translations, after extensive, really exhaustive type of research, I went up writing a book. Actually, I came out with one, then I expanded it into this. How is this possible? Now look, we're talking about the apostasy. The apostasy was to be a sign of the day of the Lord. Paul said, don't let anyone deceive you into believing that the day of the Lord has already come, because that day will not come except the falling away occurs first. So the apostasy was to be a sign of the impending day of the Lord. Paul said the man of sin was already there. Jesus said the apostasy was to be in his generation. So if the apostasy was to be and was in Jesus' generation, and if Paul said the man of sin who is linked with the apostasy was already present, was already sitting in the temple, then that must demand that the day of the Lord was to be in the first century. Well, if the day of the Lord was to be in the first century, and if the first century is past, then the day of the Lord must be past. Which raises the question, how is this possible? It means the day of the Lord was not supposed to be, as I had always thought it was, an earth-burning, time-ending event when all of the dead who have ever died and decomposed come out of the dirt. The day of the Lord must have been the same kind of day of the Lord as found in the Old Testament. The day of the Lord when God came out of heaven, Micah chapter 1, Isaiah 64:1. It would be the day of the Lord when the Lord would come in flaming fire, with a shout, with the angels, with hailstones, the sound of a trumpet. Even when heaven and earth would be destroyed. And yet, very clearly, Yahweh never, ever, ever literally, bodily, visibly came out of heaven with those literal physical attending events. Do you see the power of that? And Jesus said he was coming. His parousia. The parousia of 2 Thessalonians chapter 2 would be in the glory of the Father. Matthew 16:27. His coming in judgment would be the same way, the same manner as he had seen the Father judge. John 5:21 and 22. So if the day of the Lord, coming at the height of the apostasy, was to be a day of the Lord like the day of the Lord of the Old Covenant, then guess what? We can actually find on the pages of history events that had happened to which those scoffers and deniers could point and say, well, see, there's the judgment of Jerusalem. There's the day of the Lord. And I document all of that in this book. And yes, all of this is related to the great apostasy, because you got to ask yourself the question, if the Lord was coming at the height of the apostasy, in judgment of the little horn, in judgment of the man of sin, and some believed it had already happened, you got to be able to answer the question, how could they believe that? And it's all explained in this book. Look, go to my website, DonKPreston.com, BibleProphecy.com, and order the book, How Is This Possible? I can't pay your shipping because the cost of the book is so low, all right? But if you go there and if you order this book, and if you mention that you saw the offer on YouTube or Facebook, I will include free of charge a copy of the book, Can God Tell Time? Which proves beyond a shadow of a doubt that God can tell time, that God has always communicated truthfully in regard to time, and that all attempts to negate the time statements are nothing but the attempts of scoffers who refuse to accept the inspired testimony of what the Bible says. Well, thank you so much for joining me for this morning's morning musings. I'll see you on the flip side.